Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Bill Burns, and I'm the president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I'm honored to introduce this afternoon my friend and former colleague and extraordinary statesman, Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, Jan Eliasson. I can think of very few people who more fully embody the mission and values of the Carnegie Endowment than Jan does. And I can think of even fewer who have done more to realize them. For 4 decades, Jan has played a crucial role as a diplomat around the world. He's left an important mark as a peacemaker from the Middle East to the Balkans, from the Caucasus to East Africa, and in countless other regions stricken by conflict and humanitarian crises. It is a sure bet that whenever and wherever conflict breaks out, the world turns to Jan for his skill, savvy, and leadership. He has served his native Sweden in many capacities over the years, including as foreign minister, as an ambassador to the United States here in Washington. And he's played a number of key roles at the United Nations during his remarkable career, including as Deputy Secretary General over the past 5 years. Jan is cast in the mold of the great line of Swedish diplomats that runs from Raoul Wallenberg through Dag Hammarskjöld and Olof Palme. He is honored and built on their legacy. As Hammarskjöld was famous for saying, it is when we all play safe that we create a world of utmost insecurity. No one has ever accused Jan of playing it safe. He's a person of action, someone who's never afraid to be caught trying to do the right thing. In that way, he represents diplomacy and the United Nations at their very best. As all of you know very well, the UN will have to be at its very best if we are to navigate through an increasingly crowded, complicated, and disordered international landscape at a moment of genuine uncertainty about America's role and America's leadership. As Jan completes his tenure as Deputy Secretary General and as he prepares to pass the baton to the new Secretary General and his team, he generously agreed to share with us his parting thoughts on the future of the United Nations in a changing world and the challenges and opportunities facing the international community. I look forward very much to Jan's thoughts and to our conversation, so I hope you'll all join me in giving him a very warm welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill, for this far too generous introduction. It's a very special feeling to come back to Washington. I was ambassador here for 5 years, and I was once first secretary here for 4 years. My daughter Anna is in the room. She grew up here partly, and another daughter was born here in Washington. And to come here is a very special feeling. Although I understand that it's in a slightly different climate than it was a couple of weeks ago. I will perhaps touch upon that if I dare later on. When you gave this very generous introduction, I thought of an occasion where it wasn't so generous. It was meant to be generous, but it ended pretty badly because it was after I had served as emergency relief coordinator in the 90s on Somalia and Sudan and all these crises that occurred at the time. Balkans was starting to implode also. But I ended my term to go home to become Deputy Secretary of State. And the farewell reception was very nice. The lady who introduced me went almost overboard in praising me. And then she ended by saying, and I remember I dealt with emergency situations. And now please ask, now I will ask Jan Eliasson to come to the floor. He's the man responsible for all disasters in the world. So thank you, Bill. And let me reciprocate on 2 points. First of all, to you personally, we have been on so many barricades together over the years, Iran, Middle East situations, a number of issues, very sensitive ones, and rarely have I met a more professional diplomat, a more level-headed person to deal with. Always cool, always there for us in Europe, and a person that we trusted fully in all respects. So it's a special pleasure and honor for me to be here where you are president. And also now I also want to say to Jessica Matthews how much, this is my second point on being here on this street, how much you saved me from the routines of being ambassador here, because I was every week, twice a week in one of your, I won't say the other institutions, but this was one. Jessica, I don't know how many times you and I met in different contexts here. And this whole street was just an oasis for me, a water hole where I could pick up new ideas and saw the best of Washington. And where I also always was reminded of the great American traditions, the great American values that you stand for and that I have been formed by in a way. I spent so many years. I went to high school in America. I was an American Field Service exchange student. And I followed almost too passionately American political life, interfering in many issues. But it's just great to be with you, and I thank you for this wonderful invitation. I thought I would. I have a written speech, but it's in the hands of Hannah Gran here, and my chief of staff is also here. It's been vetted, and it's there. Maybe we could even have it available. But I thought I would speak freely in this environment, and just think a little bit about both looking back, but also looking forward for the United Nations, but also for international cooperation. And I looked at your mission statement, and when I read that mission statement, I said to myself, "Oh my God, do we need Carnegie Endowment?" The organization describes itself as being dedicated to advancing cooperation between nations and promoting active international engagement by the United States. So you have your work cut out, and we are there as a partner for you. It's almost a banality to say that we live in a world in turmoil and turbulence, but also I would say uncertainty. I must say that I feel more of uncertainty that I have felt in the past. And I ask myself, what are the reasons for this shaky ground on which we stand today? And one of the reasons, in my view, is that the process of globalization has been so much challenged and questioned without us perhaps having listened to the questions being asked. But what we have seen now is, I think, basically, if you look around the world, a tension between liberal internationalism, represented by the concept of globalization, and growingly populist nationalism. I think these are the two major trends now. And that's why the debate that you have in your country and that you will continue to have is to be seen, in my view, in this international context, where we need to look at the speed of change and the effects of globalization in several aspects which have political ramifications in any country. The open borders, of course, the great flow of information, and of course, perhaps most importantly, the growing inequalities, not so much inequalities between nations as now within nations. Those trends, I think, perhaps we did not quite analyze and look at, and perhaps some of the election results and feelings among people in the world may reflect the fact that this process was going on, and of course, all in all, it was a positive, and still is a very positive phenomenon in terms of economic growth and so forth. But we need to think about the qualitative aspects of this very important issue. The second reason why I think we are feeling this uncertainty is that the conflicts that we have around us, to me, become more and more intractable. You and I have been involved in so many negotiations, and when I look back even at my Iran-Iraq negotiations, I say this wasn't that difficult. But now when you see the Syria crisis, and you see the Yemen, and you see South Sudan, you see that, you realize that we live in a bit of a new world, where another very disturbing trend is evident, and that is the fact that so many of the conflict areas become influenced by ethnic, religious, tribal factors to a degree that I think wasn't the case in the past. Of course, we saw it in the Balkans, no doubt. But if you look back longer time in my negotiations, it was a rather rational exercise. But now you have this very strong emotional element of ethnic, religious, tribal factors involved in conflicts. And then it's much more difficult to get the negotiations under control. Furthermore, you have, of course, the element of terrorism and terrorists, which means that you have a party to a conflict which you cannot influence. You're not even allowed to speak to them, which is a huge problem. In some cases, there is a discussion about whether one should go that road in Afghanistan with the Taliban, but of course, if you look at Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, and Boko Haram, you can't imagine that you're sitting in a negotiation situation. So you have to look for other means of reaching these groups, which is new. And then there is something else which has been caused by terrorism and also now exploited by political forces that fish in pretty murky waters, in my view. And that is the fear factor. I think their whole business idea from the side of terrorists is to create fear. To make sure that people are continued divided, and that the beauty of our democracies in particular will disappear, because we will take all kinds of measures which might even cross the line sometimes, and by that reduce the attractiveness of our societies. And in a strange way, their interest coincides with those who feed on fear in the domestic political world. And I speak now as a European, where I've seen parties on that far right line side grow enormously. Mostly, I look at Sylvie here now, you know what I'm talking about. Mostly because the migration and refugee flows have caused such uproar. And as a European, I must say, I'm sad to see, I'm disappointed to see that Europe hasn't been able to mobilize a strong and unified migration refugee policy with 500 million people as a base and taking care of 1 million people refugees. The deep disappointment, I don't see much progress in that either. But anyway, I'm making a little bit of an excursion on this subject, but I think the fear factor is a very, very important factor where extremist groups have coinciding interests with some extremist parties, I would say, in today's world. Another very big disappointment to me is the decay in respect of international humanitarian law that we are seeing around the world. The protection of civilians, which is very much a mission for the United Nations, is becoming more and more difficult. We see hospitals being attacked, we see schools being attacked, and in some cases we even ask ourselves whether it is intentional. This in combination with the horrible violations of human rights is to me a huge disappointment. I was always sort of expecting things to get better and becoming more and more optimistic, especially after the end of the Cold War. But now I can't say that I'm an optimist. I say that I am a worried optimist. Now, this is a pretty gloomy picture. I will come to the hope factor, I promise you. But of course, in this situation, don't we all feel the need now to really prove that institutions can function, that the beauty of our democracy and our societies can be seen and accepted by all, a majority in our nations? I think we have now a crisis for governance, crisis for institutions, governments, European Union, UN, in some cases rightly so. And then you ask yourself, how do you restore trust, which is now absolutely basic. And therefore, I would say that institutions like yours, Carnegie Endowment, the whole civil society, individual groups, the private sector, the economic world, the scientific world, now have, I think, a great responsibility to restore hope and to show that one can make progress on issue after issue on the basis of values that we all believe in. And I think the United Nations fits in there. I think if we become relevant and become more relevant in the future, we can, of course, perhaps remind the world of these values and principles for which we were created. It's no coincidence that the first 3 words of the UN Charter, which I always carry in my pocket to prove to my UN friends here, are the same as the the words in the American Constitution, although I think you are in singular, aren't you? So we the peoples. And I think we have an obligation now to instill hope and not give up and show that these values are there and that we must stand for them, even if they are now under criticism from very serious quarters. The pillars of the UN are 3: peace and security, development, and human rights. On peace and security, I would say that the most important aspect for me of improvement, and we have a very important period ahead of us now. We have a change of Secretary General, and the Security Council's role will be absolutely crucial. But I would say that the most important reform that needs to take place inside the Security Council is that the Council would finally come to the conclusion that they have responsibility for prevention of conflict. Actually, prevention is laid down in the first chapter of the UN Charter, and Chapter 6 of Pacific Settlement Disputes is about prevention. But I think the definition of crisis sometimes by the council members, unfortunately, is seen almost as the same way as media, namely that the crisis is only in the middle of the crisis when people are dying and humanitarian action is needed desperately, while in fact the life of a crisis is this much: prevention stage and the post-conflict stage. Absolutely crucial for us, and also to show our comparative advantage in diplomacy, to play that role both in the early stages and the later stages of a conflict. I could go through a lot of reforms needed, and of course the most serious, I think, trauma for the UN is of course the fact that the Syria war has continued for so long. And it has hurt, of course, the standing of the United Nations tremendously. The second pillar is development. We say there is no peace without development, but there is no development without peace, and there is none of the above without respect of human rights, the 3 pillars. On the development side, I think I can lift your gloom and my gloom a little bit, because on the development side last year, there was really serious progress. We had the acceptance, adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, the new agenda for 2030. These goals, which to many seem too many and diverse and not very compatible, are in fact very compatible and mutually reinforcing, and turns out to be a very important tool now, economic and social planning in many countries. They're universal, mainly because our biggest challenge is, of course, climate change. So sustainability is something that unites all of us. I see Selwyn Hart here, who helped negotiate the Paris Agreement. Great to see you. So sustainability is there. So, but the combination of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement gives us a great tool in our hands to really move forward to the direction of sustainability, if member states, of course, go along. The third pillar is human rights. I have become growingly convinced that if we don't really live up to we the peoples and look at the dignity of man and accept every human being's equal worth, which it says in the preamble here, then I think we will fail. We have to measure our success in how relevant we are for people on the ground when it comes to peace, development, and human rights. And therefore, Human rights has been enhanced. It's one of the initiatives that Ban Ki-moon took to ask me to lead the work on human rights up front, to make sure that human rights violations are seen as the first early warning. And I say rhetorically, why should we wait for atrocities to occur when we could act at the human rights violation stage? We've done that far too often. We have waited too long. We have waited for things to go into the atrocity direction. So these are a couple of areas where I just think that we could and should move forward. Prevention on the peace and security side, live up to the SDGs, bring them together on the development side, and then really lift the human rights work higher up and see it as an early warning signal. Now here, of course, I come to the United States and United Nations. The United States was one of the founders of this organization. You have supported the UN over the years in a wonderful way. I have followed it in so many stages of my career, my life. And we have always found that in public opinion polls, UN has a much better standing than sometimes you can judge from the political discourse. But now I think we are in a stage where our cooperation is facing a very important period. I think we are united. I know we are united by the values that under which this organization was created. But of course there are areas where we now will have to find ways of cooperating well. One area that is obvious after what I've said, of course, is climate change, which is an existential issue. We may have a plan B in our life, but we certainly have no planet B. And we have a responsibility. It sounds perhaps a simplification talking those terms, but we have a responsibility for our children and grandchildren. When we now know that 3 years in a row we have had the hottest year in measurable history. And you see it. I've been around. I've seen the effects of sea rise in the Mekong Delta in Vietnam. I've seen the droughts in Africa. I've seen so many obvious relationships between climate change and natural disasters. And it's coming, and it's going to lead to enormous consequences if we don't really stick to the agreement in Paris. I would go even further, the more ambitious 1.5 degree. And it's absolutely crucial that we stick to this agreement. It came into force, as you may know, last week, 4th of November. So nobody can change that agreement, but of course the commitments are building on voluntary action. So it's very important that the individual nations, particularly the big ones, and here of course I speak very much about the United States, will live up to the intentions of that agreement in the interest of simply our own survival. I think that's absolutely crucial. The second issue, which is very important for everybody and for the world, is the migration and refugee issues. We have a narrative which is going in a very, very dangerous direction in Europe and perhaps also here, to see refugees and migration as a problem and a peril, not as a potential and a possibility. And I think it is obvious that we need to be reminded of certain things like economic growth dependent on migration. There are 244 million people who work in countries where they were not born. Without the migrants, we would have negative growth in several Western countries. We would have negative demographic growth, by the way, in most of Europe and North America with the migrants component. And you may know that the migrant remittances back to their own countries is 2.5 times bigger than all official development assistance in the world. So you can imagine the developmental aspects, effects of migrants being called home or forced to leave. And then I would add personally, since I'm now leaving my manuscript completely, that I think we need to be reminded also of the beauty of diversity in our societies, that most of our nation states build on diversity. If we were to go back to dividing our nations in ethnic, religious tribal lines, we would have the bloodiest century that we have ever seen. There are such tendencies in Europe, in Africa, when Nuers and Dinkas are fighting each other. I came back from Central African Republic and saw the enormous tensions between Muslims and Christians there. Last week I came back. But I also saw the beauty of what Kagame is doing in Rwanda. You may say something about his policies in some areas, but I must say the fact that he brought the Hutus together, the Tutsis together, now they are all Rwandans, combined with the 7% growth for the last 6-7 years, and one of the most prosperous nations in Africa. So the diversity is a source of strength. And in the Secretary General's comment about the election in this country, he made reference to the fact that the United States stands for unity in diversity, unity with diversity. That is actually your greatest strength. My family, back in my mother's uncles and aunts, left Sweden as enormously poor and moved to this country. And I still have relatives in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Because they came here to be, you were the melting pot. That's what's actually the cause, the great source of your strength, this diversity. So I would just like to say that we have this organization. You are very much part of it. You are determining, in fact, the vitality of this organization now. And I hope that these ideas are not only the right thing to stand for, but also perhaps the enlightened self-interest. I think the United States will want to have the United Nations deal with some of these intractable conflicts, with peacekeeping operations, mediation on our side, because otherwise nobody would get in there, or you would be asked yourself to get in there. I think the American people will require people who are dying in hunger and children are dying in cholera, that we should help. So the humanitarian elements of the UN, I hope, will be met with consensus. Election supervisions so all over the world, dealing with terrorism, because in all its aspects, not only the military and security aspects, but the deeper, the root causes, is also on our agenda. So I would hope that with this change of government that is now taking place, you would still come to the conclusion that this organization is needed. And it is an organization which is, in a way, reflecting two things. It reflects the world as it is. And it's not a pretty place. But it also reflects the world as it should be. And I tell my colleagues, as you know, every week, forget it, don't put on your rosy glasses. You have to see the realities as they are, out there in the world. And start with a very cold, cool, strong analysis of the world as it is. And then you ask yourself, what is it? How should it be? And I think our job is, at the UN, but I think I would include all of you, and not least Carnegie. I think our job is to reduce the gap. I don't say close, because that's unrealistic, but reduce the gap between the world as it is and the world as it should be. And here, I think we have a very important job to fight hopelessness and despair, and people say we can't do much about it. Stop the world, I want to get off, turn off the television. It's very easy. I think we need to just face it, and that it's not dignified to give up, but that you all have something to do. We all have something that we can do. Nobody can do everything, but everybody can do something. And there's so much to do. So thank you very much for writing.
Well, Jan, thank you very much. Thank you for coming to Carnegie this evening. Thanks so much, as I said at the outset, for your decades of service to Sweden, to the international community. Thanks for reminding us with the thoughtfulness of your remarks this evening of everything that you've both contributed and stood for over the years. You talked at the very beginning about the wave of discontent that's sweeping large parts of the globe today, with elites, with institutions, and certainly Americans demonstrated last week pretty emphatically that we're not immune to that wave of discontent. But just as you suggested, it's going to raise lots of questions about the durability of institutions, whether it's the International Criminal Court, the United Nations more broadly. What do you see to be the areas? You talked about sort of the broad areas in which the United Nations continues to play an essential role, but as you look across the international landscape and you look to a new Secretary General at the beginning of the year, what do you see to be the areas where the UN can best demonstrate its distinctive value added and quiet some of that skepticism?
Well, I think, picking up what I said earlier, I think the responsibility to act early and to act on warning signals, the first vibrations on the ground, instead of waiting for the disaster to occur, that comes back to me all the time. But it seems like both in politics and in media, it doesn't pay off to do prevention. Did you ever see a headline in the media, the disaster did not occur? And politicians who talk about what comes after the mandate period. I was foreign minister. It wasn't easy. There was an empty glance in the colleagues when I spoke about something that was 5 years old. And then I think also what is needed is to combine the work in peace and security, development, and human rights. In the past, I remember when I went to university, a professor suggested first you have peace, then you have development, then you have human rights. Forget it. You have to work with it at the same time. They're mutually reinforcing. Then I think there are new areas where we have to be relevant. And I think we started to become relevant on migration refugees with the conference in September in New York. But migration refugees, we are now having International Organization of Migration entering as a related organization, as it's called, in the UN. And then there are areas where we need to be ahead of the curve. Cybersecurity, for instance, is not really dealt with on the international scene. I think we are very poor in fighting international organized crime. So I think we should look at all the, apropos my first remark about the crisis between liberal internationalism and populist nationalism, that we have to prove that the liberal nationalism is the right thing to do. And then we have to be relevant and act on the areas where globalization has led to the problems that we have, because these problems are transported to our domestic scenes. I think what the most important thing to achieve, in my view, is with the problems like climate and migration, for instance, which is by definition impossible to solve on the national level. You can't solve these problems. But isn't then a logical conclusion, and here I'm testing it, isn't then a logical conclusion that the good international formula, let's say the Paris Agreement on climate change, or the New York Declaration on Migration Refugees, the good international formula is, in today's world, in the national interest of member states. Can you imagine, Bill, when that day comes, that yes, this issue cannot be solved nationally. Logically, we do it internationally. We compromise, we do something. What comes out is in national interest. We have so far to go to reach that conclusion. To me, it's absolutely logical. Maybe it's easier for someone coming from a country like Sweden than it is for someone from the United States, because you have so many other tools like Russia and China also to promote your national interest. But I think basically we have to come to that conclusion that the good international solutions.
I think I absolutely agree with the logic of that, Jan. I think the challenge is going to be, given people's lack of confidence in institutions, whether or not institutions with the support of member states can demonstrate their relevance, whether it's in conflict resolution, in areas of prevention, on big cross-cutting issues like water security, which you've invested so much in. Do you see any early opportunities on any of those issues when you can bring that logic in very concrete terms home to people?
No, but your point is absolutely clear, because all these things are logical to say, but if we don't have trust in the institutions that are supposed to do the job, we are in deep trouble. So we have to work on the trust issues. I remember my father, when I was the first one to graduate in my family, in high school even. And I asked him, because his and my mother's background was very simple. My aunt died in tuberculosis, actually starvation. And you wouldn't believe that Sweden was one of the poorest countries in the world back in the 1920s and 30s. So I asked him when I graduated, what is the reason why we are so prosperous now? What happened? He said 3 things, my son. We invested in infrastructure. We built the good roads, railroads, public sector, schools, hospitals, gave us jobs. He was a metal worker. And secondly, we instituted an education system which was the best in the Northern Europe, we thought. And it gave the chance to everybody, and he pointed to me, to work, study without paying 1 krona from grade 1 to university without paying anything. You are the first one to reap the benefits of that. And thirdly, apropos your question, we trusted the people who ran the cities and ran the state and ran the government. We put our best people there, and damn it, if they did anything in the area of corruption, they were out. And then he said the most unbelievable thing. You wouldn't believe it today. He said the party that promised higher taxes in the 50s won the election twice in a row. In other words, they knew that the kids would go to school. They knew that their parents and grandparents would be taken care of in hospital. So I think the biggest thing for us now is to restore faith in institutions and demand from institutions to deliver. And work so hard, whether it is a government or whether it is a European Union or whether it is United Nations. And if we fail, I think we are in for this fishing in murky waters, which is going on. But there is much we can do concretely. I could go on forever, but the water, for instance, it's absolutely crucial that we've got to focus on water, not only for health, but also for peace. I am involved indirectly and directly in so many situations now where water could be a reason for conflict and war. While in fact water as a scarce resource should be seen as a reason for cooperation. Who helps if you, in Darfur where I was, they threw a dead dog in a well? Well, who gained from that? They chased away half the population of the village, but who could go back to that village? So it's so self-destructive. I think if we could move, for instance, to make water a cause of cooperation rather than conflict, that's one step. But there are so many, that's what I meant in the end by also appealing to you and your programs, the fact that you are located in 6 places, aren't you, around the world? That you should be using the fact that you are one of the, you are a global think tank, and that you could sort of see those areas where we can do work, ideas that can lighten us up. Because the hopelessness that we are failing and that we are, the discourse is that we don't work. And that pays off, that to show that we don't work, we don't deliver. We have to deliver. And I think that, for instance, we need to really analyze globalization in such a way that we can explain it in such a way that it becomes meaningful for people on the ground, because domestic and international come together.
And I think you have to, I mean, just speaking as an American, we have to be more honest, I think, sometimes about the consequences of globalization. You know, that the truth is it hasn't lifted all boats in our society. You know, while you're going to face a situation where technology is going to advance enormously beneficial to human society, you're not going to stop that, but you have to be able to adapt and help people who are going to be. And I think that's a fair self-criticism of America.
I forgot to give you my hope factors because it was so gloomy.
I knew you were going to get to that.
I said I was going to go to the hope factors, and I forgot them. Because, no, the hope factors there are 4 hope factors for me. The first one is women. Women. It's going to be the first time in history in the next couple of decades that the women have their full empowerment in my forecast. I feel it's really finally, and it's the first time ever in human history. It's about time, and we haven't quite understood what an enormous positive strength that could be. That's my biggest hope. Women and girls. And then I also think youth. We need to take youth much more seriously. We have this sort of almost charity look. What can we do for young people? I think we should switch thinking. We should say, what can we do with young people? With young people. My granddaughter, 10 years old, Agnes, teaches me more about how I use my iPhone than anyone else. Just to give you an example, but you talk to people when you're in university and you get these ideas and you say, oh my God, they are ahead of the curve. There is so much, and we have to bring them in. And we had a resolution, Sylvie, were you there on the youth? There was a youth There is a resolution on women called 1325, Women in Peace Building, peacemaking. Now we have one for youth, 2250 is there. So in all, exactly this attitude that I hope the United Nations will stand for, more modern, reaching out and mobilize young people. And then another thing which, apropos, we need absolutely, we have to be much better with the social media. We need to, our narrative doesn't come out. I think you and I talked about that before we got in here. How much less people watch television and read papers, and instead they are living out there. And you must live, you are in this country, are you giving that some thought yourself also? I mean, there's not something that you notice that it goes so fast, and that's led to a situation of instant gratification, almost hysterical pace. How do you then have time for the discourse, seeing the aspects of classic democratic discourse? Is that being lost now in today's world? I mean,
well, and it's I think, one of the ironies is that advances in information technology and social media can provide kind of echo chambers for people. So it reinforces, a sense of almost closed-mindedness in certain societies rather than opening people up to attitudes in other parts of the world. And I agree with you. That's one of the challenges for not just governments, international organizations, but institutions like Carnegie as well.
By the way, the second hope factor was youth. The third is science, technology, knowledge, if we do it right. And I really think the academic and scientific world should be in much more. New York Academy of Science is having a seminar in the end of November on what they can do to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think on health and climate, there is so much science can do. And of course, my last element of hope is still international cooperation. So I think there is hope, although it's more difficult than I can recall for a long time.
Well, now that I've provoked you to lay out the 4 hopeful factors, on that uplifting note, let me just open it up to questions from the audience as well. We have another 15 minutes or so. All I would ask, if you'd raise your hand if you have a question, wait for the microphone to come to you. Please identify yourself and remember to end with a question. That would be great. Yes, ma'am. Yep, it's coming.
Hi, I'm Jade Wu, and this question is for our distinguished guest. On a more positive note, I'm wondering, for your entire time at the United Nations, when you look back, what is the single biggest achievement the UN has achieved during your time, and why?
If I look back historically, I think decolonization is perhaps the most important one. That the scourge of war, which is the preamble, the Third World War, didn't occur. That we had some progress on disarmament, although limited. But above all, I think the most important thing for the United Nations is that we are the organization that symbolizes the sovereign equality of member states, and that we must solve problems together. I think the most important word in today's world is together. And I think this organization, this charter, reminds us of the fact that no one can solve today's problem together. And we see as a sign of our relevance, although I'm the first one to be critical, but sign of our relevance that we have, every fall we have 120 to 150 heads of state and government coming together. We have 6,000 meetings taking place around. They meet in different combinations. The fact that we are there to sort of remind of the fact that we need to solve problems together is perhaps the most important achievement. But I also want to say Syria is a huge disappointment. I'm actually frustrated about it, what damage is done. That peacekeeping operations had been connected to sexual exploitation and abuse, absolutely unacceptable. That Haiti, we have seen almost 10,000 people die in cholera, and that we haven't mobilized a full program for eradicating cholera, and that we also haven't reached back to those who were immediately affected. by the beginning of this crisis is something that we need to take to our hearts, and we need to reach out and say that to the Haitian people. We are working on that right now. The Secretary General will give a speech on the 1st of December, which we are preparing carefully, just to say that there are so many failures also, so many disappointments. But very often it's also a reflection of the state of affairs in the world today. If it's not a pretty place, it translates into the UN. The UN is a reflection of the world as it is. But that's why I always say, you've got to remember the world as it should be.
See, yes, please, way in the back.
Thank you. Will Davis with George Washington University. Mr. Deputy Secretary General, very good to see you. As you've said, unfortunately, the United Nations is going to lose your considerable talents when your tenure comes to a close in the not-too-distant future. And since cloning technology is insufficiently advanced for
my daughter is here
to find another one of you to bring on board, what advice might you have for the incoming Secretary General on what to look for in the role of DSG and what issues and role the DSG should play? Thank you.
Thank you, Will. This is the former head of UNIC here in Washington, very well informed on UN affairs. And by the way, he has a very good successor. You should stand up. Rob Skinner, who is head of the UNIC now. Please note him. He's our man here in Washington. I don't think Antonio Guterres needs much advice. He's a great friend of mine. He's been on the barricades on the refugee side for 10 years doing the refugee work extremely well. He was Prime Minister of Portugal 7 years. I met him when I was Deputy Foreign Minister in Portugal. Very dynamic young Prime Minister. He has a great way of communicating. He has great values. He's a humanitarian. He's a very. I think we all should be very grateful he's there, and he will continue to work on prevention. He has assured me, particularly wants to use the good offices of the UN Secretary General, and act early on. Maybe also using quiet diplomacy. I shouldn't have said that now, by the way. It's quiet diplomacy. And then he, as of course, also wants to take away the sharp line between development and humanitarian assistance. We need to see that as a continuum and bring together humanitarian and development work to do. That's extremely important. That's very much in his view. And he also wants to continue the Human Rights Upfront program, Fatih and Anna. I think it will be continuity, but also with his own mark. I also want to also say to you that without Ban Ki-moon, I want to say that his time is also up, but I'm leaving with him. But I can tell you, and I think you would agree, wouldn't you, the new ambassador of Barbados, that without the Secretary General, we wouldn't have reached that agreement. He stuck his neck out, brought out the mobilization of political will, and you worked very hard at his side, but I still think he hasn't got sufficient credit for the enormous work he did on that. Plus, he encouraged me and others to work with the Sustainable Development Goals. And so these are, I think, historic achievements. And I also want to thank, because some of you are from United Nations Foundation, UNF. UNF has really done a great job in running with the ball on that. And I know UNIC is in contact with them on the implementation of the goals.
Please.
My name is Beth Kutab, and I'm wondering if you could say a bit about the Security Council and so much time and effort and thought has been put into reform of the Security Council over the years. What would it take for it to be really effective in the role of prevention of conflict?
Well, first of all, to accept to bring up preventive situations to the Council table. It was often seen as interference in internal affairs to warn about something that could go wrong. I think they should read Article 1 and Chapter 1 of the UN Charter, and also Article 33, all the things 34 also, which they should do. But I think now, since I don't have to worry about a career anymore, I think they should see the veto as a failure, or at least bad taste. Seriously, the facility, the ease with which the threat of the veto comes out and putting a wet blanket over the debates is very dangerous. I think, Bill, the Security Council should be more like a negotiation body. During the Cold War, we got used to the veto notoriously from different sides. But now, well, I don't know, I hope we're not back in the Cold War, but I hope to God we don't. But still, Syria was a horrible example of this, how we got stuck and never could get anything. Can you imagine we had negotiators like Kofi Annan, Lakhdar Brahimi, Staffan de Mistura, up until last December not having a resolution that guided their work. But if the Council could come to the conclusion that they have the privilege to be on the Council, and Sylvia, you were on the Council, that they have this gift in their hand, the veto, but to use it is a sign that they haven't succeeded in negotiation. And as a diplomat, I feel very bad about that. That if the Security Council could become much more of a negotiation body, give and take, and you come out with a result which might not be ideal, but still at least an attempt to bring out negotiate resolution, which would then be mind-binding. Every resolution in General Assembly is just a recommendation, but the Security Council resolutions are binding. It's serious stuff. I say sometimes that the Security Council should work like the Catholic Church when they select popes. They should lock them up, and then when the white smoke goes off, they negotiate it, then they've done the job.
Trying to think about
and that can be done without change of the charter.
if you can stretch that metaphor very far, but just one. I'm sorry. One.
I can
last,
take two if you like.
All right, two quick questions, Jessica, please.
I'd be interested, Bill, in your thoughts as well. You hear so much, especially in the last week, about people's loss of faith in institutions. It's hard for me to believe that anybody thinks in terms of institutions. It's such a dead, kind of vague word, right? And nobody interacts with, quote, institutions. They interact with something or other in their own lives. And so I wonder whether you buy that, or can you really can you give life or meaning or something that's real to this phrase? People, and you said also worldwide, have lost faith in institutions. It's hard for me to believe that can be a global phenomenon that stretches across everything from, well, institutions covers almost everything.
Would you want to start first?
Start. No, go ahead. I'll join.
No,
in.
you're right. I mean, who would love institutions? You're right. I mean, this is a good challenge for us. I think we simply have to deliver. We have to connect. It's actually instead you could say governments. Our leaders. We haven't been able to communicate. We haven't been able to show what the goal was with standing up for these principles. We didn't live up to the need for equality. We didn't look at the effects of certain measures on the situation out on the ground. Sweden was receiving more refugees per capita than any other country in Europe 2 years ago during the big crisis. But the Prime Minister told me that he had such a big problem of achieving this because the people out in the villages and towns who received 400 refugees, and maybe they had 2,000 people in that village, they said, we cannot deliver. The schools don't function. We don't have no place for them to sit, and now we have a place to live. Now we have a cold winter. What do? So there was not a bit of, anti-immigration. It was just, we want to take care of them, right? So that's why he said to me that we have to get this under control. We can't receive so many as we do now. And I think you have to be very practical and really try to show in practice that you live up to the values and principles that you stand for. I think that requires a more compassionate relationship to what is in fact in the UN, what is the effect on the people in the end, we the peoples, and what is the effect on the voters, not only in the big cities and in our environments with the friends you meet, but also out there. I called my friends in Indiana and got pretty good indication of where they were headed in your election. So I think we have to be very much hands-on and ask, how do we make life better? How can we prove that our model of our values are really meaningful to people, and to be very concrete? So I think it's a crisis of leadership here. Anyone. But it goes beyond government. Right now, I think you have an anti-politician trend also, as you notice. That anyone who is associated with these processes is toxic, practically. It's a bit exaggeration, but it's very dangerous. So I think you have to be very hands-on, and really ask yourself, what are the effects? And you're right, I think we should avoid talking about institutions.
Said. The last question, please, way in the back, sir.
My name is Eric. How effective are international free trade agreements, and what does your organization do to foster or inhibit
agreements? The UN is only indirectly engaged. We have, of course, the World Trade Organization, and we have UNCTAD, which is also dealing with world trade. But I must say, during my 4.5 years in my job, I haven't really dealt with trade issues, but it is, of course, absolutely crucial for international cooperation. And I think we need, again, apropos the simplifications, we need to really analyze what free trade means. If one country institutes new taxes or new tariffs, you have automatically countermeasures, which would then translate into higher consumer prices in Walmart, in your case. And that also in today's economy, even for instance, the cars Volvo in my hometown, Gothenburg, I think 70% of the parts from Volvo are coming from other countries. And if you look at any industry, you will see that you have an import factor which is enormously large. So you import-exports come out, are interdependent. So I think in today's world we really need to learn more about that. I think the trade issues has been, again, out among the specialists. It hasn't been translated to simple debate, what it means to restore production back to the industrial age and to rebuild those factories that you see when you ride the Acela between Washington and New York is probably not a realistic alternative. There we have I think, and now I speak as European, as a Swede, also a Swedish minister, that we didn't make that as alive as we should have, what it would mean. I was high school in Indiana. They got the box for lunch, and they went off to work. And the guy in the drugstore and the guy who worked in the factory that made cigar boxes in Decatur, Indiana, they came back. They were a member of the same Rotary Club, and they went to basketball games on Friday. We went to picnics on Saturday. There was dance in the high school. Everybody had a job. Where are we today? How do we explain that life? And that is, I can explain to any city in Europe. And then you have the migration factor. I was honored to be asked to give the speech for the Swedish National Day 2 years ago in Sweden. And my theme was Sweden in the world. Everybody loved it. Dag Hammarskjöld, Raoul Wallenberg, Olof Palme, and some of us work there now. But then I said, it's not only Sweden in the world, it is also in today's world, the world in Sweden. You also have we are in a historic stage where it's not only Sweden in the world, it's the world in Sweden. And I would claim that the strongest societies in 10, 15 years' time are those who can integrate that right, do that right, to be both a part of the world, but also accept that in today's world, the world is also inside our own countries. The beauty of diversity, as I spoke about, as a strength. I must say the applause were much more widespread on the first part, Sweden in the world. The world in Sweden was more confusing because 15% of the Swedish people are now born abroad. Really different thing today, than the homogeneous Scandinavian society we had in the past. But I think this is the biggest challenge for all of us to realize that the world has changed to such a degree that my grandparents, in Sweden, you moved from the city to from the rural areas to the city. Now Anna is an American citizen and a Swedish citizen, lives here. Johan worked in London, our son, and Emily is married to a Dane. So we are now part of the global community, and I think the vitality of our societies will be decided by how well we take this to our hearts. But it's not easy. You can't sort of sit on a high horse, as we say, and think, oh, you should live up to our liberal values. No, you have to sort of understand that this is a painful situation, and especially if there are cultural values involved, you need to come under the skin and speak that language, and then move it from there. I think that's a very important task we all have now. I think this is time for soul searching, but also for, I think, a bit of innovative, hopeful action that we can do. That there is always a niche where we now have to push the positions forward on the basis of those values, but perhaps with a little bit more of realism and closer to the ground. I think that's where I am now.
Well, Jan, on behalf of all of us here this evening, you've provided us with a wonderful reminder of why the international community, why the profession of diplomacy has been so fortunate for so many years. So please join me in thanking you.
Thank you.